In the rural backwoods of Virginia, along a forgotten road swallowed by wild oak and creeping vines, stood the remains of a farmhouse. Its timbers sagged as if pulled down by the weight of its own secrets. Windows, long shattered, stared outward like hollow eyes. The locals avoided it. Even in daylight, the Sullivan house was approached only by silence. But beneath that decaying structure lay something no community dares to claim, a truth whispered for nearly 2 centuries, then buried under the earth like an unholy relic. The basement. When investigators first entered in 1834, they were met with a smell that never truly left the stone. The stench of rot, of damp earth soaked with years of neglect. Their lanterns flickered against walls where rusted chains were still bolted into place, each anchored low to the ground as though meant for bodies that could never stand. Scattered across the dirt floor lay shoes, tiny shoes. Some scuffed, others torn, all arranged as if dropped in frantic struggle. There were carvings too, crude etchings scratched into the stone. Names. Tallies. Prayers cut into rock by desperate hands. 47 children were found here. Some are alive, broken, too weak to speak. Others, reduced to bones still tethered by shackles. What horrifying truth was buried beneath the Sullivan home? And why was it hidden for nearly 2 centuries, shielded by silence and fear? Because this is not simply the story of one family's descent into cruelty. It is the story of an entire community that chose blindness. Neighbors who turned away. Leaders who silenced questions. A system that preferred darkness to revelation. The Sullivan house still lingers in memory, not as a ruin of wood and stone, but as a symbol of what people will allow when terror takes root in silence. And so we begin, at the surface, with the illusion of ordinary life, a facade that concealed chains waiting in the dark. In 1834, Virginia was a land suspended between 2 worlds. To the casual eye, the small town scattered across its rolling fields appeared timeless, scenes of plowed furrows, horse-drawn wagons creaking along dirt roads, and church bells summoning families each Sunday morning. Neighbors greeted one another on porches with polite nods, children ran barefoot along fences in the heat of summer. Life seemed predictable, steady, untouched by scandal. It was here, in this quiet rhythm of farming and trade, that the Sullivan family lived. To outsiders, they were the picture of respectability. Nathaniel Sullivan, stern but commanding, was a landowner who managed his estate with discipline and efficiency. His wife, Margaret, carried herself with the piety of a woman devoted to both scripture and social duty. Together, they presided over their property and their household with a gravity that invited admiration from some and unease from others. The Sullivans hosted dinners for local dignitaries, their tables laid with fine china and imported wine. Ministers praised their contributions to the church, merchants acknowledged their role in supporting trade. They appeared, in every sense, to embody stability, an anchor for the community. And yet, beneath the sheen of this public life, whispers had already begun. Neighbors noted the peculiarity of the Sullivan home. While other households opened their shutters to let in the southern sun, the Sullivan windows remained tightly closed, even in the sweltering heat. Curtains were drawn, not just at night, but always, creating a facade that seemed less like a home and more like a sealed vault. The children of the family were rarely seen. Rumors told of cousins, wards, or distant relations who had come under the Sullivans' guardianship. But where were they? In a town where children spilled into the streets and fields with laughter, the Sullivan grounds remained eerily silent. Not once did a passerby recall seeing a game of chase across the lawn, or the faint sound of a lullaby drifting from an upstairs room. Still, most pretended not to notice. In 1834, curiosity could be dangerous, and suspicion even more so. The Sullivans' wealth gave them a shield, their influence a subtle weapon. And for a town dependent on landowners and fearful of shame, silence became easier than confrontation. A traveling peddler once remarked, after delivering goods to the estate, that he had glimpsed a shadow at an upstairs window, a small figure, pale, unmoving. When he mentioned it in passing at a tavern, the response was swift, murmured disapproval, eyes turning away, conversations quickly redirected. The Sullivans were not to be spoken of in that manner. The truth was not hidden by walls alone. It was concealed by complicity. A kind of collective blindness grew, nurtured by fear and reinforced by convenience. To question why the Sullivan shutters never opened, or why the field surrounding their home yielded no laughter of children, was to risk drawing the wrong kind of attention. So they did not ask. Instead, they clung to the illusion, the image of the Sullivans as pillars of propriety. After all, what harm could possibly fester behind locked doors, in a house that hosted ministers and officials alike? The thought was unthinkable, and therefore, for most, it was never thought at all. And yet, there were signs, small, unsettling details that did not align with the polished image. Servants who arrived to work at the Sullivan estate were rarely seen again. When asked, Nathaniel would explain they had moved on, or married into families elsewhere. Records of their departures, however, were suspiciously absent. Late at night, those living closest to the estate reported noises drifting across the fields. Some swore they heard muffled cries, faint but undeniable. Others dismissed it as the wind twisting through the trees, or animals prowling the dark. A farmer's wife who lived half a mile away once confided in her diary that she heard the sound of many small voices in lament, as though from beneath the earth itself. Her words were never spoken aloud during her lifetime. Even the local church, a place where sins were meant to be confessed and the veil of secrecy lifted, became a partner in silence. Ministers, receiving generous donations from the Sullivans, chose not to entertain rumors. From the pulpit, they cautioned against gossip, condemning suspicion as a seed of evil. Parishioners listened and obeyed, suppressing doubts that gnawed at them during restless nights. This was the surface illusion, a town at peace, a family admired, and a silence that grew thick as smoke. A silence that shielded chains and shadows. For the Sullivan home was not merely a house on a hill, it was a boundary. On one side, the world of appearances, where neighbors shook hands and ministers gave blessings. On the other, a darkness none dared name, festering just beyond the drawn curtains. The town did not fail to see. It simply chose not to. And as the illusion hardened, the truth beneath the surface only deepened its roots. Soon, even those who sensed its presence learned to live with it. But illusions, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot endure forever. The Sullivan house was patient. And what it concealed would one day force its way into the open, shattering the calm of 1834 Virginia, and leaving behind a question that would never truly be answered: how could an entire community live beside horror, and yet pretend it was not there? To understand the darkness that would one day be uncovered beneath the Sullivan home, we must first look backward, into the roots of the family itself. For the horror of 1834 did not emerge suddenly, but rather was cultivated across generations, woven into the very marrow of the Sullivan name. The lineage traced back to the earliest European settlers in Virginia. The first Sullivans arrived in the late 1600s, carving their place into the wilderness with iron tools and rigid conviction. Unlike many families who intermarried and blended with neighbors, the Sullivans remained insular, their bloodline deliberately preserved. Land, marriages, and influence were kept tightly within their circle. To outsiders, this determination was admirable, even enviable. To those who lived closest, it carried the sharp scent of control. By the time the 19th century dawned, the Sullivans were well-established landowners. Their holdings were vast, their reach long, and their reputation one of stern respectability. But along with their prominence came an intensity of belief, a conviction that the world was best ordered through discipline, purity, and separation from what they deemed corrupt or unworthy. This ideology, passed down like scripture, became both their armor and their curse. At the center of the 1834 story stood Nathaniel Sullivan, the family patriarch. He was a man described in early court notes and fragmented diaries as tall, severe, and possessed of a gaze that did not waver when others faltered. Nathaniel spoke often of bloodlines, of inheritance, of purity. He was not content to simply preserve wealth, he believed he was preserving something sacred. His letters, preserved in fragments, reveal a fixation on maintaining a lineage untainted by weakness. In one such letter, written to his brother in 1827, Nathaniel wrote, "Purity is not merely the gift of the Lord, it is the labor of man. We are chosen to protect what others would squander." His wife, Margaret Sullivan, was no less formidable. While Nathaniel wielded authority through land and law, Margaret's dominion was spiritual. Known in town as a devout woman, she was rigid in her interpretation of Scripture, obsessed with the themes of sacrifice and obedience. She held prayer meetings in the Sullivan home, her voice described by one attendee as cold fire, without warmth, yet impossible to disobey. Her influence over the household was absolute. Servants feared her, neighbors respected her distance, and children, those few glimpsed through fleeting rumors, were subject to her relentless devotion to discipline. It was under their stewardship that rumors began to surface of children being taken in by the Sullivans. At first, the narrative was one of charity. Orphans, it was said, had been received into the family's care. Margaret herself was rumored to have spoken of her duty to protect the lost lambs from the corruption of the world. To the townsfolk, the story carried an air of nobility, even righteousness. And yet, there were inconsistencies. The number of children taken in was never clear. No one could say precisely how many wards lived within the Sullivan home, or for how long. They were seldom seen outside, never present in church, and curiously absent from community gatherings. It was whispered that some of these children came from poor families who had entrusted them to the Sullivans, persuaded by promises of education or employment. Others may have been orphans without guardians to protect them. But when pressed for details, records failed. No baptismal entries, no school attendance, no confirmations. The children seemed to vanish into the walls of the Sullivan estate. Fragments of correspondence from the family add chilling depth to these rumors. In one letter, Nathaniel wrote of purifying the household through discipline, that no corruption may enter. Another, preserved in a faded diary of a distant cousin, described Margaret's belief that children are clay, to be shaped through denial, silence, and sacrifice. Such language, cloaked in religious fervor, suggests more than simple guardianship. It hints at an obsession with molding and controlling, a fixation with transformation through suffering. To those who looked closer, a pattern emerged. The Sullivans did not merely take in children. They collected them. And once under their roof, the world seemed to forget they existed. The contradictions between public image and private reality grew sharper with every passing year. Portraits of Nathaniel and Margaret from the period depict a couple both regal and severe, the kind of images hung in parlors to inspire respect. Yet those who served in their home often did not remain long. Few spoke openly, but one account survives. A letter written by a maid who fled the estate in 1832, confessing that she could no longer endure the prayers that lasted through the night, the cries from unseen rooms, the constant warning that obedience is the only path to salvation. Her words end abruptly, as though she feared discovery. Here lies the contradiction that defined the Sullivan name: outward pillars of society, inward architects of dread. Their obsession with purity, their fixation on sacrifice, their insularity and control, all were seeds planted long before the events of 1834. And like seeds, they grew in silence, watered by fear, nourished by complicity. The illusion of charity concealed something far darker. For every child taken in, the walls of the Sullivan home grew heavier with silence. For every whispered prayer of purification, a shadow deepened in the rooms behind those shuttered windows. The town continued to look away, telling itself the Sullivans were pious, that their ways were merely stern, their privacy a mark of their discipline. But in truth, they were already cultivating something monstrous. And in the shadows of their lineage, one question lingers: were the Sullivans merely products of their time, rigid in their faith and insularity? Or had the seeds of cruelty been planted generations earlier, waiting only for Nathaniel and Margaret to give them shape? Whatever the answer, the groundwork for horror was already in place. The children, the letters, the prayers, all were fragments of a puzzle no one dared piece together. Not yet. By the early 1830s, faint disturbances had begun to stir in the quiet records of the community. The first to notice were not neighbors or ministers, but clerks, men tasked with keeping tallies of workers, apprentices, and wards. Their ledgers tell a story that at first glance seems ordinary: names entered, wages calculated, families assigned. But upon closer inspection, patterns emerge: children and youths listed as employed one season, only to vanish entirely from record the next. A farmhand, age 12, indentured from a poor family in exchange for modest pay, noted as placed with the Sullivan estate in 1831. No later entries exist. An orphan boy sent from the county poorhouse in 1832, intended to receive both work and shelter at the Sullivan farm, his name struck from the rolls within months, no explanation offered. Others followed: wards, servants, and apprentices whose lives simply dissolved from paper and memory once tied to the Sullivan name. These disappearances were subtle enough to escape notice in their time. After all, children of the poor often vanished into hardship, lost to disease, flight, or neglect. Records were incomplete, families transient. But when traced together, the pattern grows undeniable. The Sullivan household was a point where names went to die. Beyond the ledgers, unease found its way into personal diaries. Several accounts survive from townsfolk who lived near the Sullivan property. Their words, never meant for public eyes, describe strange nights when silence was broken by sounds no one wished to explain. One farmer's wife wrote in 1833, "The air carried a noise unlike the wind, a chorus faint and terrible. It seemed as though children wailed from beneath the earth. I pressed my ears, but still it lingered, long after my husband swore he heard nothing." Another account, from a blacksmith's apprentice, described walking home after delivering iron tools to the Sullivan estate. Passing through the fields, he swore he heard rhythmic banging, metal against stone, accompanied by voices too faint to decipher. "It chilled me to bone," he confessed in his journal, "for it was not the sound of labor, but of struggle." Yet these whispers never crossed beyond ink. To speak them aloud was to invite ruin. Everyone knew the power the Sullivans held, and more importantly, the fear they inspired. The town survived on landowners' goodwill, and to accuse one of impropriety was to risk being cast out, or worse. And so the voices in diaries remained sealed, and the community walked on in silence. Among the most haunting accounts comes from the journal of a schoolteacher, Miss Lydia Harrow, who kept meticulous notes on her pupils. In early 1832, she recorded the arrival of 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who attended her small school for a brief season. They were described as timid, withdrawn, their clothes plain but well kept. They came each morning escorted by a servant from the Sullivan estate. Then, one day, they did not return. Miss Harrow inquired discreetly, but was told by Margaret Sullivan herself that the children had been taken back into the household, where their education would continue in proper faith. The explanation satisfied no one, least of all Harrow. In her journal she wrote, "Their absence sits ill with me. Children do not vanish into thin air." Yet the matter is closed to question, for who dares challenge the Sullivans? Her entries darkened in tone thereafter. By late that year, she noted hearing rumors from older pupils, who claimed to have glimpsed pale faces watching from the shuttered windows of the Sullivan house. They looked not curious, but pleading, one boy confided. Harrow recorded the claim but never dared act upon it. Weeks later, her journal ends abruptly, perhaps abandoned out of fear, or perhaps destroyed by her own hand. Such were the first signs. The missing names in records, the cries at night, the sudden disappearance of children who once brushed shoulders with the community before vanishing behind shuttered walls. But each sign was small enough, subtle enough, to be swallowed by silence. The town told itself stories of runaway orphans, of families who moved on, of sounds that were nothing more than restless wind. Still, unease grew. Whispers spread quietly among servants and laborers, who spoke of locked rooms, of stern prayers echoing long into the night, of a house that seemed to consume rather than shelter. But even those whispers trailed into silence when ears drew too near. And so, the community carried on, market days, Sunday services, harvest festivals, while at the edge of their vision, the Sullivan home loomed with its closed shutters and quiet fields. The illusion of peace endured, even as the shadows lengthened. Because in truth, they did see. They heard. They wondered. But to name the unease aloud was to confront a terror too large to bear. And so, they chose silence. The records of missing children, the diaries of troubled neighbors, the vanished pupils, they all remain today as faint footprints leading to a conclusion no one dared acknowledge in its time. A conclusion that would erupt in horror when the basement doors were finally forced open. But for now, in 1833, the signs remain just that, whispers, suspicions, and uneasy scratches of pen upon paper. The storm was gathering. The silence was tightening. And the Sullivan estate, hidden behind its shutters, continued its quiet work. The horrors of the Sullivan home did not survive so long merely because of secrecy. They endured because of silence, an enforced quiet, cultivated and maintained through the careful machinery of fear. The Sullivans knew their place in the hierarchy of 1830s Virginia, and they wielded it with precision. Wealth was their first shield. Land and property granted the Sullivans a voice that poor families lacked. When suspicions arose, when whispers trickled about missing children or cries in the night, the Sullivans smothered them not with denial, but with authority. They would remind others of their standing, benefactors of the church, supporters of trade, hosts of dignitaries. To question them was to risk not only social ruin, but economic survival. Families who depended on their patronage quickly learned the price of suspicion, a contract revoked, a debt called in, a field left barren without labor. But intimidation went beyond subtle financial control. The Sullivans carried themselves with a sternness that discouraged inquiry. Nathaniel's gaze was said to reduce men to silence. Margaret's cold recitations of scripture could chill even the most devout parishioner. Servants whispered of strict punishments for disobedience, punishments that, while never openly confirmed, were severe enough to keep mouths tightly shut. One rumor told of a boy, hired briefly as a stable hand, who dared speak of strange sounds in the night. He was dismissed the next morning, his family threatened with eviction from their rented plot unless they forgot the matter entirely. They did. Religion provided the second wall of protection. Margaret Sullivan in particular weaponized scripture with skill. In gatherings held within their home, she spoke of obedience as the highest virtue, framing doubt itself as sin. To question authority, she warned, was to question God's design. These words echoed from pulpits as well. The church, receiving heavy donations from the Sullivans, became complicit in the silence. Ministers delivered sermons condemning gossip and urging submission to divine order. Questions, they preached, led only to corruption. Suspicion was the devil's seed. And so, the congregation obeyed. They folded their doubts into silence, telling themselves that obedience was godly, and that to challenge the Sullivans was to defy not only men, but heaven. The structure of Virginia society further ensured complicity. Poor families, already vulnerable, had little recourse. To accuse a family of wealth and standing was to invite disgrace or punishment. Local law favored the landowner, not the tenant, and justice bent easily under the weight of influence. Even those who felt unease in their bones chose silence, for what protection could they hope to find? A word spoken against the Sullivans might cost a livelihood, or worse, a child. Thus, fear grew roots not in one place, but in many. Woven through purse strings, pulpits, and social order. And at the center of it all, looming above the community like a silent sentinel, was the Sullivan house itself. The structure was a fortress as much as a home. Its windows remained shuttered, sealing in whatever transpired within. Servants were bound not only by employment, but by threats both spoken and implied. One servant's diary, found decades later in fragments, described being sworn to secrecy upon entering the household. "My words must not leave the walls. Even to write this is peril, yet my mind will not rest." The entry ends abruptly, as though fear had stilled her pen. The basement, later to be revealed as the heart of horror, was already a source of rumor. Its doors were barred, locked with iron fastenings, and strictly forbidden to all but the Sullivans themselves. Deliverymen noted the strange insistence that supplies, wood, tools, even food, be carried only to the cellar entrance, never beyond. Those who obeyed and asked no questions were paid well. Those who lingered too long, or appeared curious, were dismissed with cold precision. The house itself seemed designed to swallow sound. Heavy curtains muffled noise, thick walls dulled echoes, and the great shutters sealed light away. To stand at its gate was to feel unwelcome, watched, as though the house itself was aware of trespass. Together, these forces, the wealth, the intimidation, the sermons, the structure, created a machinery of fear that was near impenetrable. Suspicion might stir in diaries, in whispers after dark, in glances exchanged between neighbors, but it rarely reached the air of daylight. Each individual doubt was quickly smothered by the weight of authority pressing down from above. And so, the Sullivans continued their work unseen, their home sealed tight, while the community carried on with bowed heads and averted eyes. The system worked, not through violence alone, but through the quiet, relentless pressure of silence. Yet silence does not erase. It only delays. For every barred door, for every sermon urging obedience, for every family too fearful to speak, there remained the echo of unanswered cries. And in time, those echoes would break through. For years, the Sullivans had built their wall of silence. Wealth, intimidation, piety, all of it worked to shield them from questions that lingered at the edges of the community's conscience. But in 1834, the machinery faltered. Whispers grew into murmurs, and murmurs into demands. The unease that had festered in diaries and private journals finally reached ears that could not turn away. It began with persistence. Several families, already poor and desperate, pressed authorities for answers regarding their missing children. Records pointed again and again to the Sullivan household. At first, officials resisted, unwilling to provoke a family of such standing. But the rumors became too numerous, too consistent, too loud to ignore. And so, reluctantly, an inquiry was opened. On a gray morning in late autumn of 1834, officials rode to the Sullivan estate. Accounts described the sky as heavy, the fields damp with mist. They carried with them not only warrants, but unease. Aware that what they might find would bring shame not only upon one family, but upon the entire community that had looked away for so long. The Sullivans resisted. Nathaniel demanded to see the papers, his voice sharp, his authority unbroken. Margaret clutched a Bible, declaring the intrusion an act of blasphemy. But the officials pressed on, their lanterns lighting the dim hallways of the house. The air was close, heavy, as though the walls themselves resented the intrusion. Then they came to the basement. The doors were barred with heavy iron, the locks thick with rust. When pried open, the hinges shrieked as though in protest. A rush of air, damp and sour, spilled upward from the darkness below. Witnesses later described the stench as suffocating, rot, mildew, and something far worse, the unmistakable odor of decay. Lanterns were lowered. The light revealed stone walls streaked with moisture, dirt floors worn hard by countless footsteps. And then the chains. Rows of them, bolted into the walls, trailing across the ground, clinking softly as the lantern glow caught their rusted links. And there, in the suffocating dark, the truth emerged. Children. Some still alive, their bodies frail, eyes wide and unblinking against the sudden intrusion of light. They shielded their faces, some crying out weakly, others too broken even to move. Their wrists and ankles bore the scars of restraint. Their clothes hung in tatters. And mingled among them were others, remains reduced to bone, still bound by chains that had held them long past life. Tiny shoes scattered across the floor, some upright, others toppled, all mute witnesses to suffering. The walls told their own story. Etched into the stone were markings scratched by desperate hands, tallies numbering days, prayers carved with trembling strokes, names written again and again until the rock itself gave way. Some were unfinished, broken mid-line, as though their writers had been silenced mid-prayer. One official later wrote in a private account, "I could not bring myself to count them, yet others did. 47 in total, some in flesh, others in bone. The air was alive with cries and death together. I felt my soul recoil, as though I had stepped into a place not made for men." The discovery should have shattered the community's silence. It should have brought swift justice, loud condemnation, unrelenting exposure. But it did not. For in that very moment, when lanterns revealed horror and chains clinked softly in the dark, fear reasserted itself. Officials recoiled not only at the sight of the children, but at the implications. To admit the truth was to admit years of neglect, of willful blindness. To speak it aloud was to brand the entire town complicit. And so, even as the children were carried out, gaunt, trembling, eyes glazed by years of shadow, the machinery of containment began turning once more. Records were sealed, reports softened. Words like misfortune and neglect replaced harsher truths. The dead were buried quickly, the living dispersed quietly into institutions, their names erased from ledgers as though they had never existed. Courtrooms heard whispers of trials, but no verdicts were truly handed down. The Sullivans, through influence and fear, escaped the full weight of justice. Nathaniel's wealth and Margaret's religious standing shielded them. Their reputation, though stained, was never obliterated. And the community complied. Families who had once begged for answers now turned away, told themselves it was better left unspoken, that the less said, the sooner peace might return. Silence, once again, smothered the cries. But silence cannot erase memory. The basement remained, its chains rusting, its walls heavy with etched prayers. And though officials had tried to contain the story, the truth had already broken through. Those who entered the cellar that day carried its images for the rest of their lives, images of children shackled in darkness, of bones clinging to chains, of names scratched desperately into stone. It was the moment the illusion shattered, when whispers became undeniable, when the darkness beneath the Sullivan home rose at last into the light. And yet, even revelation was not enough. Horror was found, but horror was buried again, hidden not beneath stone this time, but beneath silence, fear, and shame. The question would linger for centuries: how could 47 children suffer in chains, unseen, unheard, while a town carried on with its harvests and Sunday prayers? The basement had answered, but only in fragments. And the rest remained buried, waiting, festering in the shadows of history. For a moment, the world threatened to see. In the weeks following the raid on the Sullivan home, shock rippled through the quiet Virginia countryside. Word spread quickly, as word always does, whispered first in markets, then repeated on porches, until it seeped into every corner of the county. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men lowered their voices in taverns. The basement had been discovered, and with it, the lives of 47 children. Newspapers caught fragments of the story, but always in vague terms. Headlines spoke of a troubling discovery and misfortunes within a respected household. No article dared to print the full extent. Even then, language became a weapon, Words like chains and bones were avoided, replaced by gentler euphemisms that dulled the horror. For the survivors, there was no gentleness. Those who were pulled from the basement's shadows were too frail to be returned to families. Many had no families to return to. Orphans and laborers who had vanished years before. Instead, they were sent to poorhouses or institutions already overcrowded and indifferent. In those gray walls, their names disappeared, replaced by numbers, their lives folded into the anonymity of the forgotten. A few perished within months from sickness and neglect. Others endured, but always with the weight of what they had seen, the scratching of names into stone, the slow silence of chains. No record survives of their testimonies. No archive holds their voices. Whatever they spoke of that cellar, if they spoke at all, was silenced long before the words reached the page. And the Sullivans? Nathaniel and Margaret Sullivan faced inquiries, yes. They were summoned to courts, questioned by officials. But influence stretched long shadows. Records of proceedings were sealed or vanished altogether, leaving only gaps where truth should have been. Some accounts suggest that fines were levied, others whisper of private agreements, but no punishment befitting the crime was ever delivered. The Sullivan name, while scarred, endured. Their property remained intact. Their wealth remained untouched. The community accepted this outcome, or rather, they allowed it. Public scandal burned briefly, a fire fed by outrage and fear, but leaders quickly smothered the flames. Ministers stood at pulpits and urged their congregations to focus on prayer, not gossip. Judges insisted that further unrest would only prolong suffering. Neighbors told themselves they had been deceived, that the horror had been hidden too well for them to know. But beneath these justifications, guilt festered. Diaries from the period reveal a people haunted. One farmer's journal records, "I hear them still, the cries that others claim not to hear. At night the wind through the oaks sounds like chains. God forgive us for what we allowed." Another entry, written by a local woman months after the discovery, trembles with unease, "We passed the Sullivan home and none speak. It stands there, though it should not. The windows are black, yet I feel watched. The earth remembers even if we pretend not to." Nightmares became common. Whispers of children crying in the distance, of cold hands tugging at skirts, of names recited in voices no longer alive. The people of the town refused to discuss it openly, yet privately they carried the torment. They had seen what was found in the cellar. And worse, they had known, in some unspoken way, long before the doors were ever broken open. The silence returned, heavier now than before. It became an unspoken pact: do not ask, do not tell, do not remember. Generations would inherit this silence, a ghostly inheritance heavier than land or wealth. But silence is never complete. A story like this cannot be contained forever. It seeps, even when smothered, finding cracks in history where it whispers through. Torn diary pages. Missing court records. Scattered mentions in newspapers. Like the scratches in stone walls beneath the Sullivan house, the evidence cannot be fully erased. The aftermath was not justice. It was not healing. It was a burial, one more burial atop the dozens already suffered beneath the Sullivan floor. And so, the town carried on. Fields were planted. Churches filled on Sundays. Children played in the streets once more, though always under watchful eyes. Life resumed its rhythm, as it always does, but beneath the surface lay a pulse of dread. For those who had stood in that cellar, for those who had glimpsed the horror and turned away, the memory remained, carved as deeply into the mind as the prayers etched into stone. Storms rolled across Virginia that year, heavy rains drowning fields, thunder shaking homes. Some said the weather itself was a punishment, nature echoing the cries buried beneath the soil. Others dismissed it as coincidence. But in diaries and letters, again and again, one theme emerges: guilt. The Sullivan house still stood. Its shutters are still closed. Its basement doors, though broken once, were barred once more. The people walked past, eyes averted, refusing to admit that the building loomed not as a home, but as a monument to silence. For most of Virginia, the Sullivan affair was a rumor, a whisper half believed, half dismissed. But for those who lived far beyond the county lines, the fragments that leaked out carried a peculiar weight. To outsiders, the story was irresistible: a respectable family, an old farmhouse, and a basement where chains rattled in the dark. Reporters came first. From Richmond, then from New York. They arrived on horseback and in carriages, boots caked in mud from backroads that locals claimed led nowhere worth traveling. But their curiosity was sharper than caution. One Richmond journalist, Thomas Harker, wrote in his notes, later preserved only through his widow's letters, that what drew him was not merely the scandal, but the silence. Men guard their secrets fiercely, he wrote. But when an entire town refuses to speak, there is something far darker beneath. Harker published a piece in the Richmond Enquirer, his words restrained yet heavy with implication. It has come to our attention that a property in Culpeper County harbors a cellar of unspeakable design, where chains were found not for livestock but for the smallest of limbs. The article made its way into parlors and taverns, setting off a wave of hushed speculation. But within a week, the issue was recalled. Later editions carried only a retraction. Earlier reports of abuses in Culpeper County were exaggerated and without merit. Harker was reassigned to cover agriculture and shipping routes. Within months, he resigned. New York papers attempted bolder strokes. The Evening Herald ran a headline, "Children in Chains, the Sullivan Mystery." The language was lurid, describing dungeons fit for the Inquisition and victims too weak to stand. For 3 days, the Herald sold briskly on street corners. And then, silence. The presses moved on. Articles vanished from archives, replaced with blank spaces where scandal had been. Not every outsider was silenced so quickly. Lawmen from neighboring counties who had been called to assist in the raid carried memories that could not be buried. One deputy, Samuel Price, attempted to testify before the state legislature, arguing that the Sullivan family must face trial in full. His statements were noted briefly in the record, before being struck from the ledger. Weeks later, Price vanished. His family claimed he left for the frontier. But neighbors whispered that he had been last seen entering Culpeper County, riding toward the Sullivan property. He never returned. Another man, Constable Aaron Bell, found his reputation destroyed. After describing the horrors he had witnessed in the basement, 47 children, many reduced to bone, he was denounced as a drunk and dismissed from service. Bell died in poverty within a year. His diary, discovered decades later, contained only one recurring phrase written again and again: "They are still there. Even when I close my eyes." But it is the story of Thomas Harker's widow, Eliza, that survives most clearly. In a letter dated 1837, she confided to her sister, Thomas was never himself after Culpeper. He would wake at night, crying out that he heard scratching beneath the floor. He believed the children still called to him, demanding their names not be forgotten. And then, as suddenly as it began, his voice was silenced. "They called it fever, but I know better." Eliza's words, preserved in family papers, hint at the toll the Sullivan affair took not only on those who endured it but on those who tried to reveal it. Reporters, lawmen, outsiders, each came with the promise of truth, and each left marked, ruined, or erased. The pattern became undeniable: the story rose, flickered in the light, and then was extinguished. Again and again, the same cycle repeated. Public memory was not just fragile, it was manipulated, buried under wealth, influence, and fear. The machinery of silence that had shielded the Sullivans within their town now extended outward, swallowing voices from Richmond, New York, and beyond. Yet every attempt to erase the story left fragments behind. A yellowed newspaper clipping, a widow's trembling letter, a constable's broken diary. Enough to suggest that the truth had once burned brightly, if only for a moment. Enough to remind us that some horrors cannot be fully contained. And still, the Sullivan house stood. Its shutters closed, its cellar sealed. Outsiders came, tried to pry open its secrets, and vanished. The community endured, tighter in its silence, heavier with its guilt. The question lingered like smoke: how much power does it take not only to bury a crime but to erase the memory of those who tried to speak of it? Time does not erase all wounds. Some fester, seeping through the cracks of memory and into legend. For the Sullivan property, silence never meant forgetting. Even after the last of the Sullivan family line faded from the county rolls, the farmhouse remained. Its shutters sagged, its roof caved inward, but the basement, the true heart of its terror, remained untouched. Locals avoided the grounds, muttering of ill fortune. Yet for generations, whispers persisted. Children walking home from school claimed to hear faint cries echoing across the fields, as though carried by wind from beneath the earth. At night, travelers spoke of lantern light moving inside the abandoned house, though no one lived there. And again, the most chilling account surfaced: the sound of chains, faintly clinking in the dark, followed by the unmistakable echo of children weeping. The legends grew with each retelling. Some said the spirits of the 47 remained bound to the cellar, counting endlessly, their tallies scratched into stone unfinished. Others insisted the Sullivans themselves, damned by their deeds, walked the corridors as shadows, ensuring the children never escaped, even in death. The property changed hands many times. A merchant purchased it in the 1870s, intending to clear the land for crops. He abandoned it within months, leaving behind letters describing a heaviness in the air, as if the soil itself resists the plow. In the early 1900s, an ambitious family tried to restore the farmhouse. They fled in the night, leaving food still laid upon the table. Their neighbors recalled the muttering of scratching in the walls and small footsteps in the attic when no one was there. By the mid-20th century, the Sullivan home had become more ruin than residence, its windows black sockets, its doors hanging loose. But the basement remained sealed, a scar hidden just beneath the earth. It was not until the rise of urban exploration in the 1970s that the cellar was forced open again. Groups of thrill-seekers, armed with flashlights and crude cameras, pried past the barred door and descended into the dark. What they found was not legend, but proof. Photographs emerged, grainy, ghostly, yet unmistakable. Chains still bolted into the stone. Rusted links sprawled across the dirt floor. Crude carvings on the walls, some resembling stick-figure children, others nothing but desperate scratches. There were words too, faint but legible under the beam of light: "Forgive us. Let us out." Names etched again and again, as if the act of writing could anchor the self against oblivion. Some images showed what appeared to be crude drawings: a circle of figures holding hands, a house with bars drawn over its windows. Whether left by imprisoned children or carved later by superstitious trespassers is unknown. But the effect was the same: an unshakable sense of presence, of voices that had not faded with time. The photographs circulated quietly at first, among small circles of paranormal researchers, then in fringe magazines devoted to hauntings. One, printed in a 1983 pamphlet, shows a child's shoe half buried in dust, the leather crumbling but intact. Another captures a wall covered in notches, 47 tallies, grouped into uneven clusters. The implication was impossible to ignore. Skeptics argued the images could be staged. But those who entered the cellar carried with them the same story upon return: the air was heavy, suffocating, as though the earth itself pressed against their lungs. Flashlights flickered inexplicably. Some reported hearing whispers, faint yet layered, like children reciting prayers in unison. A few claimed to have seen shapes move along the far wall, small, shifting, just beyond the reach of light. Local authorities responded with the same pattern that had defined the Sullivan legacy since 1834, denial. Vandals, they said. Old iron mistaken for chains. Water damage mistaken for carvings. But the photographs told a different story, one too tangible to dismiss as imagination. Even now, the Sullivan property sits in ruin, but it has not been forgotten. Ghost tours whisper of it, though rarely by name. Historians glance past it, unwilling to reopen wounds. Yet the images remain, circulating in hushed corners of the internet, resurfacing when curiosity and dread intertwine. The past returned not through official histories, but through legend, rumor, and grainy photographs. And in this return, one truth became clear: though the Sullivans had been buried, though their secrets had been suppressed, the children had not gone silent. Their cries, carried through stone and soil, ensured the world would not forget. But what unsettled the most was not the sound of chains, nor the names carved into stone. It was the realization that each attempt to bury the story only made it resurface with greater weight. The past did not fade. It waited, restless, demanding to be seen. And still, the question lingered: if the children's voices carried on this long, what else lies chained in the dark, waiting to be uncovered? The Sullivan story does not live only in the basement of a ruined Virginia farmhouse. It lives in the silence that surrounds it. The most haunting truth was not that one family could commit such horrors, but that an entire town allowed it. For nearly 2 centuries, the question has lingered: how many knew? How many turned their faces from the cries carried across the fields at night? The records offer only fragments, but even fragments reveal complicity. Diaries note strange noises, yet their authors end the sentences with ellipses, as if unwilling to finish the thought. Neighbors wrote of the Sullivans' peculiar ways, but never pressed further. Local clergy, whose sermons thundered against minor sins, fell utterly silent when it came to the locked cellar and the children who entered but never returned. This is the psychology of collective blindness, a terror that spreads not by action, but by omission. To live in the shadow of the Sullivan house was to make a choice. To acknowledge what might be happening, or to seal one's mind as firmly as the basement doors were sealed with iron. The majority chose silence. Historians call it willful ignorance. Psychologists might call it diffusion of responsibility. In truth, it was simpler: fear. Fear of power. Fear of losing one's place in the delicate social order. Fear that to speak aloud would draw the wrath of the very forces they pretended not to see. What does such silence cost? It creates scars not just upon the victims, but upon the entire fabric of a community. Generations later, descendants of those who lived near the Sullivans spoke of inexplicable shame, as if they had inherited guilt that was never theirs to carry. Children asked their grandparents why the stories of missing youths were never reported. The answers were evasive: it wasn't our place. We couldn't do anything. It was best not to meddle. But silence is action. By refusing to speak, they allowed the chains to remain fastened, the cries to echo unanswered. The Sullivan case is not isolated. Across history, patterns repeat. In factories where children toiled unseen. In orphanages where discipline concealed cruelty. In modern institutions where abuses fester for decades before surfacing. The mechanisms remain the same: a powerful figure, a culture of fear, and a community choosing not to look. The Sullivan house becomes less an aberration than a mirror, reflecting the ways horror hides in plain sight. One can sense the weight of this truth in the language of old letters. A farmer writing in 1833 described seeing a boy I'd not known before, pale and thin, walking beside one of the Sullivans. He added, "I thought to inquire, but thought better of it." The phrase "thought better of it" reappears again and again, as if the collective conscience of the town learned to fold itself inward, to survive through silence. The psychological toll of this silence is immense. Entire communities learn to mistrust themselves, to question what they saw and heard. Some believed the cries in the night were their imagination. Others convinced themselves that the Sullivans' charitable work must be true, because the alternative was unthinkable. This pattern echoes in later atrocities. Survivors of institutions in the 20th century recall neighbors dismissing their accounts, saying, if it were true, someone would have stopped it. The same denial that smothered the Sullivan story reappeared in different guises, proving that silence is not bound by time or place. The Sullivan basement, therefore, becomes more than a site of one family's cruelty. It becomes a symbol of human avoidance, the ways people bury what they cannot face, even if burying it allows horror to grow unchecked. It shows how silence protects not the innocent, but the guilty. And yet, silence does not last forever. The chains were found. The carvings were uncovered. The truth clawed its way to the surface, even if those who lived closest to it refused to speak. The children's cries endured in legend, in whispers, in restless memory. This raises a final, unsettling question: do we ever truly escape such complicity? The Sullivan town tried to erase the story, but it returned, reshaping itself into folklore and haunting. Each photograph, each rediscovered diary, forces us to face what silence costs. Perhaps the true horror is not what happened in the basement, but what happened above it, an entire community moving through daily life, attending church, trading goods, laughing at festivals, while beneath their feet, chains clinked in the dark. And perhaps the most terrifying thought of all is this: if silence once allowed such horrors to persist, what horrors now lie hidden, unspoken, behind the locked doors of our own time? The official story of the Sullivan family was carefully buried. Court transcripts were sealed, newspapers were pressured into silence, and government records quietly vanished from local archives. For the wider world, the incident barely existed. In official histories of Virginia, the name Sullivan appears only in scattered land records, absent of scandal, absent of horror. And yet, whispers persisted. They clung like shadows to the ruins of the Sullivan homestead, carried in hushed tones through generations. Farmers who settled nearby spoke of the land as cursed. They noted that no matter how fertile the soil seemed, crops withered when planted too close to the crumbling foundation of the Sullivan house. "The ground rejects what we place upon it," one man wrote in an 1872 almanac, as though the earth itself remembers. The descendants of the Sullivan family scattered across the South and beyond. Some left Virginia entirely, settling in the Carolinas, Kentucky, or further west. Many changed their names, erasing the association with the house on the hill. A few clung stubbornly to the surname, claiming their ancestors were victims of slander, not perpetrators of atrocity. But even they moved in silence when asked too much. The house itself did not stand long. By the late 19th century, neglect had rotted its timbers. A storm in the 1890s toppled its roof, and locals scavenged the bricks for barns and wells. By the turn of the 20th century, only the cellar remained, half buried and choked with vines. Yet the cellar was the one place no one dared to enter. Children dared each other to approach the barred doors, but even the boldest refused to descend. Stories grew of cries still heard below, of chains that rattled in the windless dark. Folklore cemented the ruins as a site of dread. Campfire tales claimed that those who entered the basement would never return unchanged. Farmers told of their livestock refusing to graze near the house. A traveling preacher declared the land unfit for man's dwelling, and some said he carried away fragments of chain as proof, though the preacher himself vanished from the area shortly after. The deeper unease lay in records that contradicted the official story. While the number of children discovered in the cellar was recorded as 47, several sources suggested otherwise. A sheriff's deputy who later left Virginia wrote in a private letter that he believed the count was closer to 60. A fragment of a coroner's report, found decades later in a courthouse basement, listed remains unnumbered, commingled beyond identification. If these hints are true, then the official tally was a deliberate understatement, crafted to minimize scandal and protect reputations. 47 children became the fixed number, repeated until it sounded less like horror and more like myth. But the ground may hold a darker truth, still unrevealed beneath the weeds and collapsed stone. The Sullivan case, then, ends without closure. There was no justice, no lasting record, no acknowledgement of what the victims endured. The children who survived were scattered, absorbed into poorhouses, their names lost. The children who perished remain unnamed, their graves unmarked. The family responsible was never fully punished, their wealth and influence shielding them as effectively as the barred cellar doors had shielded their crimes from view. And yet, silence cannot erase everything. The whispers have never died. They surface in diaries, in the shaky recollections of aging townsfolk, in the ghost stories told to frighten children. They linger in the unease that locals still feel when passing the overgrown plot of land. Perhaps that is the final punishment, the refusal of the land to forget. Where history books are silent, the soil itself seems to bear memory. Where officials tried to smooth the story into nothingness, the rumors only grew. Each generation inherits not certainty, but suspicion. Not facts, but dread. The Sullivan basement may no longer stand, but its presence has not faded. And as long as questions remain, how many children were truly there? How many lives were consumed in the dark? The story cannot rest. It is said that history repeats itself. If so, then the Sullivan case is less a closed chapter than a warning. A reminder of what silence protects, of what communities choose not to see, and of what horrors can be hidden in plain sight. And perhaps the most terrifying truth is this: even now, nearly 2 centuries later, no one knows the true number. Was it 47? Or was it more? In the 1920s, when the Sullivan property had long since fallen into ruin, a group of locals, curiosity seekers and amateur historians, ventured into the remains of the cellar. Most found nothing but collapsed stone, rotting timbers, and the stink of earth heavy with moisture. But wedged beneath a crumbling beam, they uncovered an object that would become the most unsettling relic of the case, a small leather-bound ledger. The book was warped with damp, its cover cracked, its clasp eaten by rust. Inside, its pages bore lists of names, some full, some marked only with initials. Many were crossed out with thick strokes of ink, as though erasing a life from existence. The handwriting shifted across the pages, steady at first, then increasingly erratic, the letters jagged and crowded, as though written in fever. As the ledger progresses, the neat record-keeping gives way to something more disturbing. Entire sections dissolve into scripture-like ravings, passages copied from the book of Leviticus, twisted into declarations about purity, sacrifice, and the cleansing of sin. On the final pages, words tumble into near illegibility, ink bleeding through paper as if pressed too hard, the phrases repeated over and over: the lamb must be kept. The lamb must be bound. The lamb must be made clean. Scholars who later examined the book could not agree on its meaning. Was it a record of children taken in? A ledger of punishments? Or something darker, a catalogue of possession, of ownership, of ritual? The ledger remains perhaps the single most haunting artifact tied to the Sullivan house. No court documents survive. No graves are marked. Only this book, fragile and fragmented, survives to testify to what took place in that basement. And so, we are left with the final, unanswered question, one that has lingered for nearly 2 centuries. What was the true purpose of the Sullivan basement?